Ordinary people face something immense and silent, watching and waiting in the darkness, where mystery and fear collide in moments that defy all logic. In this video, you'll hear 6 gripping tales that defy everything you've been told. From missing eggs arranged in eerie circles to massive shadows moving silently through storms. From strange marks on cabins to unsettling disturbances that defy explanation. These 6 stories reveal chilling encounters with unseen forces. On the fog-thickened evening of June 9th, 2025, Marcus Hale sat behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler, rolling steadily along the narrow highway cutting through the dense forests of western Montana. At 52 years old, Marcus was a seasoned truck driver who had spent more than 3 decades navigating this rugged terrain. Known among his peers for his sharp instincts and calm under pressure, he prided himself on his safety record. That night, however, something shattered that confidence irrevocably. The sky was a muted gray, swallowed by thick fog that clung low to the ground and blurred the edges of the road. It was well past midnight, and the usual hum of the truck's engine and the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence of the wilderness. Marcus's eyes were peeled, scanning the road ahead as his rig rumbled forward, the beams of his headlights barely penetrating the mist. Then, without warning, a hulking figure stepped onto the highway less than 50 feet away. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs as he slammed on the brakes, tires screeching in protest against the slick surface. The truck lurched violently, but despite his desperate effort to stop, the monstrous shape was struck with a sickening thud beneath the rig's wheels. The impact shook the entire vehicle, rattling loose bolts and shaking Marcus in his seat. Blinking through the fog, Marcus caught a fleeting glimpse of the creature staggering. It was enormous, easily twice the height of an average man, covered in thick, dark fur that glistened with moisture. The figure turned, revealing broad shoulders and a powerful frame, then lumbered off the road into the shadowed trees, disappearing as if swallowed whole by the night. Adrenaline surged through Marcus's veins, cold and electrifying. He pulled over to the shoulder, heart pounding, eyes darting nervously into the dense underbrush where the creature had vanished. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the heavy mist, the cold air biting at his skin. The silence was suffocating except for the distant crackling of leaves underfoot. On the ground where the truck's tires had passed, a dark, sticky substance stained the asphalt, glistening under the flashlight's beam. Kneeling cautiously, Marcus reached down and touched it with a trembling finger. It was thick, almost tar-like but organic, blood or something close to it. His gaze moved to the dirt and mud beside the road. There, pressed deeply into the wet earth, were footprints unlike anything he had ever seen. Each print was at least 16 inches long, wide and deeply grooved, with 5 thick toes splayed widely. They looked like gigantic human feet, but no human that size could exist here or anywhere. Marcus's mind raced. The area was known for bears and elk, even mountain lions, but these tracks were far too large and distinctly shaped. The fluid was unlike any animal blood he'd encountered. His throat tightened as questions spun wildly. What had he hit? What had fled into the woods? He felt both fear and a strange, growing fascination. By the time authorities arrived hours later, dawn was creeping behind the horizon, turning the fog into a dull gray mist. Marcus recounted the event in detail, voice steady but eyes haunted. However, the official investigators remained skeptical. They pointed to the spilled cargo, crates of dark maple syrup from a broken container in the truck's bed, as the source of the sticky fluid. They examined the footprints and claimed the heavy truck's passage had distorted ordinary bear tracks, enlarging and reshaping them beyond recognition. No physical remains of an animal were found in the surrounding woods, despite a thorough search. The local sheriff's department classified the incident as a bear collision, standard protocol for such crashes in this region. Marcus's insistence that the creature was something else, a giant fur-covered beast, was met with polite disbelief, whispers of overwork or exhaustion. His fellow truckers exchanged knowing glances but offered little more than uneasy nods. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself haunted by that night's memory. The image of the towering figure burned into his mind. His confidence eroded as he doubted his senses, wondering if fatigue had played tricks on him. Yet word spread quietly among the trucking community about the strange accident on that remote Montana stretch. Stories circulated about something lurking in the woods, something monstrous and untamed. Other drivers who frequented the highway began to avoid night runs through that foggy corridor altogether. Some spoke of eerie howls echoing between the trees or shadows glimpsed just beyond the headlights' reach. The consensus was a silent shared fear of the unknown. They warned newcomers to be careful, to keep alert for signs of the giant that no official report would acknowledge. Despite repeated calls for further investigation by Marcus and others, the authorities remained firm, adhering to the official narrative of a bear strike complicated by spilled cargo. No follow-up searches uncovered any additional clues. The footprints faded in the rain, the mysterious fluid evaporated, and the highway returned to its quiet routine. But for Marcus, and those who believed the whispered warnings, the truth was undeniable. Something extraordinary had crossed the road that night, something unthinkable. In the solitude of his home, Marcus replayed every detail, haunted by the knowledge that a creature of unimaginable size roamed those Montana woods, unseen by the world, but terrifyingly real. The memory of the impact, the shock of seeing those limbs vanish into the shadows, left an ache deep in his chest, a mixture of fear, awe, and a burden of secrets he could neither explain nor forget. The highway remained a passage through a wild frontier, where man and legend brushed shoulders in the cold fog, and the line between reality and myth blurred beneath the dense canopy of ancient trees. On that June night, Marcus Hale had been the reluctant witness to something the world wasn't ready to see, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on him as heavily as the rig's wheels had pressed on the giant's fleeing feet. On the chilly morning of September 14, 2019, Maria Ivanova tightened the straps of her backpack with practiced hands, ready to embark on what was supposed to be a routine solo trek deep within the Ural Mountains. At 34, Maria was an experienced bushwalker and survivalist, well-versed in the demands of wilderness travel. She knew the risks of going alone, but the dense, ancient forest called to her, promising solitude and a rare chance to reconnect with nature in its rawest form. The air was crisp and sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of cold that seeped through clothing and made breath visible like tiny clouds in the pale morning light. Ancient firs and oaks stretched upward, their thick branches knitting together to form a canopy that filtered the sun's weak rays. The forest floor was a patchwork of mossy stones, fallen leaves, and tangled roots, demanding careful footwork at every step. Despite this, Maria moved steadily forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, loamy ground, each crunch of twigs and rustle of leaves echoing in the quiet wilderness. She followed a narrow, unmarked path, winding deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees grew older and the air grew heavier with silence. The distant call of a woodpecker and the rustle of small animals skittering through underbrush were the only sounds accompanying her progress. Hours passed, with the steady rhythm of her steps, her breath steady and controlled, as she admired the shifting hues of autumn beginning to color the forest with gold and crimson. At a small clearing bathed in the weak midday sun, Maria stopped briefly to catch her breath and check her map. The isolation wrapped around her like a thick blanket, yet she felt calm, confident. She pulled out her phone and dialed her mother's number, a ritual that brought comfort during solo excursions. The call connected quickly and her mother's warm voice steadied her nerves. Maria spoke softly, describing the peaceful scene around her, the gentle sway of branches, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of a breeze threading through the trees. But as she glanced toward the forest edge, her voice shifted, dipping into a lower, cautious tone. She noticed movement, something large, shadowy and slow, stirring between the trunks of the trees. It was far too tall to be human, she thought, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the dappled sunlight. She strained her eyes, trying to make sense of the figure as it stepped cautiously through the dense forest, moving deliberately but with an unnatural grace. The silhouette's frame and thick hair were unlike anything she had seen in her years of trekking these mountains. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm, speaking slowly to her mother as she tried to process the sight before her. Suddenly, her voice faltered. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the figure paused, seemingly aware of her presence. The phone call cut out mid-sentence, the line going dead without warning. Maria's heart pounded fiercely, a rising panic pressing at her chest as she stared into the woods. But the figure had vanished, slipping away like a shadow melting into the dense undergrowth. The forest returned to its eerie silence, heavier now and charged with an unspoken menace. Maria's breath hitched as she scanned the trees, feeling eyes upon her, though she saw no movement. The sky darkened as clouds gathered overhead, and a creeping chill crawled over her skin. Despite the fear creeping into her limbs, she knew she had to move, to find shelter before nightfall. But the forest around her had changed. The once familiar path had disappeared beneath a tangle of fallen branches and thick moss, replaced by a confusing maze of tree trunks and dense brush. Maria pushed forward, navigating carefully through the gloom, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft patter of her footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig beneath her boots. As darkness fell, the temperature plunged, and a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the forest in a ghostly haze. Maria's sense of direction faltered, her limbs growing heavy with exhaustion and cold. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly as she wandered, desperate for a safe place to rest. But the forest refused to yield. Then, by chance or fate, she spotted a tree unlike any other, an ancient oak with a broad trunk that split near the base, forming a hollow large enough for a person to crawl inside. Driven by exhaustion and instinct, Maria crawled into the dim cavity, the rough bark scraping her skin as she settled onto a bed of soft moss and leaves. The hollow's interior smelled of earth and decay, but it was dry and sheltered, a sanctuary amid the unforgiving wilderness. Days passed in a blur of disorientation and fragmented consciousness. Maria drifted in and out of awareness, her mind a fog of confusion and fear. She had no memory of how she had arrived in the hollow, or what had transpired in the days before. Her body ached from cold and hunger, but she bore no visible wounds. The forest outside remained ominously silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures. When search teams finally found her nearly 3 weeks later, Maria was curled inside the hollow, weak and disoriented but alive. Rescuers carried her gently from the tree's embrace, her eyes fluttering open to the harsh daylight, the world unfamiliar and overwhelming. Despite her physical recovery, she remained silent about her ordeal, retreating into herself as if guarding a terrible secret. Around the base of the ancient oak, investigators discovered a series of enormous footprints pressed deeply into the soft earth, forming a rough circle around the tree. Each print measured at least 18 inches long, wide and round, with thick toes splayed unnaturally. The impressions were unlike any known animal tracks in the region, too large and too distinctly shaped to belong to bears or wolves. Officials dismissed the prints as distorted marks caused by fallen logs and muddy bear track, insisting Maria had simply fallen and sought refuge in the hollow to survive. No further investigation was conducted, and the official report closed the case as a wilderness survival incident. Yet the local villagers and forest workers whispered of a guardian of the woods, a colossal, shadowy figure that watched silently from the trees, an ancient protector or captor of those who wandered too far from the beaten path. Some believed it was a spirit of the forest, others a living legend hidden from the world. Maria's disappearance and miraculous rescue became a story told in hushed tones around campfires and village gatherings, a chilling reminder of the mysteries lurking beneath the canopy. Though she never spoke of what had happened during those lost days, the giant footprints encircling her refuge remained a silent testament to an unseen presence, a shadow that still watches from the depths of the Russian wilderness. On the mist-heavy morning of October 3, 1987, 5 seasoned hikers entered the dense heart of Germany's Black Forest, a region steeped in ancient legend and shadowed by pines that blot out the sky. The group, composed of longtime friends, Marcus, a forestry guide, Ingrid, a biologist, Stefan, a mountain rescue veteran, Claudia, an experienced trekker, and Tomas, an amateur photographer, were no strangers to the wilderness. Each had logged thousands of kilometers across Europe's wildest places, confident in their skills and respect for the forest's dangers. They had planned a 5-day trek, carefully packed and equipped with sturdy tents, climbing gear, and ample supplies. Their goal was to reach a seldom visited clearing deep inside the forest known only to locals as Die Still Lichtung, the silent clearing, rumored to be a place of eerie stillness and strange happenings. Despite local warnings, the group's curiosity and adventurous spirit drove them forward. The first days passed uneventfully. They set up camp each night, shared stories by the fire, and tracked wildlife signs during the day. The forest enveloped them in a mix of tranquility and subtle tension, its quiet beauty interspersed with faint, unplaceable sounds, whispers of wind or branches cracking under unseen footsteps. On the evening of October 7th, the hikers arrived at the clearing just as the sun dipped behind the dense canopy, bathing the forest floor in long shadows. They chose a sheltered spot near a cluster of ancient beeches and began setting up camp. The air was unusually still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, an unnatural silence settled over the clearing. The usual night sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were absent. Instead, the air hung heavy and cold, pressing down on the group. Unbeknownst to them, unseen eyes watched from the darkness beyond the tree line. In the early hours of October 8th, a storm of brutal force erupted upon the campsite without warning. Whatever had attacked moved swiftly and silently. When rescue teams arrived days later, they found a scene of utter devastation. Tents shredded beyond recognition, backpacks crushed and torn, sleeping bags ripped apart, and cooking supplies scattered across the muddy ground. The campfire was cold, its ashes scattered like spilled bones. 5 bodies lay sprawled within the wreckage, faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. Autopsies revealed that each victim had suffered fatal blunt force trauma, bruises, broken ribs, and cracked skulls, but there were no bite marks, no claw wounds, no evidence of human assault. The injuries suggested immense strength, far beyond what any animal in the region could inflict without leaving typical marks. What baffled investigators most was the state of the victims' fingernails. Each hiker's nails were broken, gouged, or missing entirely, and some had tiny shards of dark, fibrous material lodged beneath the skin. Laboratory analysis failed to identify the fibers. No plant, insect, or animal known to science matched their composition. The ground around the campsite bore no footprints or signs of dragging. Instead, investigators found an unsettling arrangement of broken branches and snapped twigs, meticulously placed in jagged circular patterns around the clearing, as if marking a boundary or warning. The patterns were too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Weather records confirmed the night was calm. No storm or natural event could explain the damage or the injuries. The official conclusion offered by authorities was inconclusive: a freak accident, an unknown animal attack, or a tragic event triggered by human error. But the lack of concrete evidence left the case open, haunting the minds of those who studied it. Locals living near the forest spoke only in whispers of Der Schatten, the shadow, a silent, unseen force that roams the woods, striking without warning and leaving behind inexplicable signs. They believed it to be a guardian of the forest, punishing those who disturbed its peace. The eerie branch patterns were said to be warnings, symbols of an ancient power older than the trees themselves. Hikers who dared enter the Black Forest since that night spoke of a heavy silence that descends without cause, the sensation of being watched by something invisible, and the sudden feeling of overwhelming dread. Some reported scratches on their skin and dark fibers caught beneath their nails after brief encounters with the forest's depths. The silent clearing remains off-limits, a place avoided by even the most daring. The mystery of the 5 hikers' deaths lingers in the cold air, a chilling reminder that some forces in the wild refuse to be understood. Beneath the canopy's shadow, something waits, silent, patient, and unyielding, its presence marked not by footprints or voices, but by the broken nails and shattered lives of those who vanish within its grasp. On a crisp spring morning, March 12, 2023, Joe Mitchell rose before dawn to begin his day on the isolated slopes of his Appalachian farm. At 58, Joe was a lifetime farmer, his hands weathered by years of toil, and his instincts finely tuned to the rhythms of nature. His small farm sat tucked deep in the mountains of West Virginia, far from neighbors or towns, surrounded by thick woods that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Joe's daily routine began with checking on his flock of chickens, nestled safely inside their sturdy wooden coop. He'd raised these birds for years, knowing each by sight and sound. On this morning, as he approached the coop, a familiar unease gripped him. The dozen eggs he had counted the previous evening were missing again, another empty nest. At first, Joe suspected the usual culprits: raccoons, known to raid coops under cover of night, or perhaps local thieves taking advantage of his remote location. He set several traps near the coop, wire cages baited with corn and chicken feed, hoping to catch the thief or predator in the act. Yet each morning the traps remained untouched, and the eggs continued to vanish one by one, night after night. The mystery deepened when Joe decided to search the surrounding woods for any sign of disturbance. Armed with a flashlight and a sturdy walking stick, he wandered beneath the oaks and maples, their branches whispering softly in the cold wind. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, broken twigs, and crushed undergrowth, evidence of small animals moving about, but nothing unusual at first glance. Then on the morning of March 18th, Joe stumbled upon a clearing he had never noticed before, hidden deep in the forest about half a mile from his farm. In the center lay an astonishing sight: the missing eggs, piled neatly in a perfect circle on a bed of moss. The eggs gleamed in the soft light, untouched and unbroken, as if deliberately gathered and arranged by unseen hands. Around the circle of eggs were barefoot prints pressed deep into the soft earth, each print measuring at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The toes were splayed unevenly, and the shape was irregular, nothing like the tracks of deer, bears, or any other known wildlife in the region. The earth was soft from recent rains, making the impressions sharp and clear. Nearby, Joe noticed countless broken twigs and flattened plants, the destruction spreading outward from the clearing in a wide radius. The damage was uneven but deliberate, as if a colossal creature had moved silently, avoiding noisy steps but leaving its mark on the fragile forest floor. The entire area bore the heavy scent of musk and damp earth, mingled with an unfamiliar, faintly acrid odor that unsettled Joe deeply. His heart pounded as he realized he was standing at the edge of something beyond explanation, a presence that defied logic and threatened the safety of his farm. Returning home, he resolved to alert the local authorities, hoping for help or at least an investigation. However, when Joe reported his findings, officials dismissed the claims as the work of pranksters or ordinary wildlife behavior blown out of proportion. They suggested raccoons or bears might have dragged the eggs away and then abandoned them for unknown reasons. They dismissed the enormous footprints as old or distorted impressions caused by erosion and mud, something easily misread by inexperienced eyes. Despite the official skepticism, Joe's unease only grew. Nights on the farm became restless. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals seemed quieter, as if subdued by an unseen force watching from the shadows. On several occasions, Joe reported hearing low, guttural growls echoing faintly through the trees, too deep and resonant to belong to any known animal in the Appalachians. The sounds seemed to rise and fall with the wind, always just beyond the edge of hearing. The farm dogs, usually alert and vocal at any disturbance, grew uneasy as well. They would bark fiercely at unseen figures lurking at the edge of the forest, but retreat cautiously when Joe approached. On one chilly night in early April, Joe woke to the sensation of being watched. Peering through the window, he glimpsed a shadow moving silently among the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Afraid but determined, Joe avoided going near the clearing alone, especially after dusk. He set up cameras around the perimeter of the forest edge, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was responsible for the vanishing eggs. But the footage returned blank. No animals, no people, nothing but the swaying branches and shifting shadows. The mystery deepened when the circle of eggs was found missing one morning, taken entirely without trace. No tracks, no signs of disturbance beyond the clearing itself. Joe's attempts to gather more evidence were met with frustration, as the forest seemed to hold its secrets tightly, the invisible watcher slipping away like a ghost. Neighbors and local farmers spoke quietly of strange sightings, tall, shadowy figures glimpsed fleetingly in the woods, deep growls heard at night, and footprints too large to be explained by any known creature. Stories circulated of a guardian of the forest, or a creature displaced by human expansion, driven to strange behaviors in a changing world. Despite the increasing rumors and Joe's own terrifying experiences, the official position remained unchanged. The mystery of the vanishing eggs was filed away as unsolved, unexplained, or perhaps dismissed as the product of imagination and coincidence. But for Joe Mitchell, the farm was no longer a place of simple rural life. It had become the edge of a dark unknown, where ancient forces might still roam free, unseen, but ever present. The strange circle of eggs, the massive footprints, and the silent watcher in the shadows were a haunting reminder that some mysteries of the forest are better left undisturbed, their answers buried deep beneath the whispering leaves and towering trees of the Appalachian wilds. On the bleak morning of February 23, 2021, 5 friends, Adam, Rachel, Brian, Elena, and Marcus, loaded their gear into a battered Jeep and set off toward a remote corner of the Rocky Mountains. They were no strangers to harsh conditions. Adam, a former military medic, was precise and steady. Rachel, a wilderness guide, was calm and sharp. Brian, a veteran mountaineer, knew every crack in the ice. Elena, a botanist, studied alpine plants with curiosity. And Marcus, a skilled tracker and hunter, carried a quiet confidence born from years in the wild. Together, they planned to spend a week testing new winter gear and enjoying the solitude of the mountains, prepared for anything nature could throw at them. The sun hung low behind gray clouds as they ascended, pine trees coated in heavy snow bending beneath winter's weight. Their campsite was a sheltered clearing surrounded by granite cliffs and dense forest, nearly inaccessible except on foot or skis. They unpacked efficiently, setting up tents and gathering firewood despite the biting cold. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine resin and frozen earth. Snowflakes drifted lazily at first, then thickened as the day wore on. By late afternoon, the weather shifted abruptly. Dark clouds roiled above, blotting out the sun and turning the world a steel gray. The temperature dropped rapidly, breath turning instantly to frost in the cold air. Then came the first fierce gusts, sharp, icy blasts that sliced through their layers of clothing. The gentle snowfall transformed into a violent blizzard, the wind howling like a banshee through the trees, carrying sharp shards of ice that stung exposed skin. Realizing the severity of the storm, the group abandoned plans to build a fire and sought shelter in a narrow cave wedged between 2 cliffs. The entrance was just large enough to squeeze through, but inside the cold cave the walls glistened with frost, and the air was still and heavy. They huddled close, sharing body heat beneath layers of parkas and emergency blankets. Outside, the snow whipped fiercely, blanketing the world in white and muffling all sound. The storm raged for hours, the relentless wind battering the rocks and trees like a living thing. Time lost meaning as the friends sat in tense silence, broken only by their shallow breaths and the occasional scrape of gear shifting against stone. Outside the cave's mouth, the world was a blinding swirl of snow and darkness. Then, amid the storm's roar, faint and strange noises reached their ears, low, guttural sounds. almost vocal but not quite human. The tones rose and fell rhythmically, resonating deep in their chests, as if some creature far larger than themselves was communicating through the howling wind. They strained to listen, eyes darting toward the frosted trees beyond the cave's edge, but the blizzard's fury obscured everything. Between moments of wind lull, shadowy shapes moved silently through the forest's edge, silhouettes, taller and broader than any elk or bear, drifting effortlessly through the snow-covered pines. The friends caught glimpses of dark outlines, shifting like living shadows, their movements fluid and deliberate. No sound came from them, no crunch of snow or snap of branches, only a presence that seemed to watch patiently and invisibly. Inside the cave, tension mounted. The group noticed that their belongings, once strewn haphazardly near the entrance, had been disturbed. Ski poles, previously leaned against the rocks, were crossed into neat X patterns. Backpacks, tossed carelessly, were stacked carefully in piles. Food containers had vanished from their packs. The careful arrangement was unnerving, too deliberate, too intelligent to be the work of wind or shifting snow. Curiously, the snow outside remained pristine despite the blizzard and the proximity of the watchers. No footprints, no animal tracks, no signs of movement marred the fresh white. It was as if the presence observing them moved without disturbing the earth or snow, slipping through the storm like a ghost. For 2 full days and nights, the friends endured the storm's wrath and the creeping dread within the cave. They rationed their dwindling supplies, taking turns standing watch and whispering quietly to calm one another's nerves. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the strange sounds and shifting shadows lurking just beyond their fragile sanctuary. When the storm finally subsided on the morning of February 25th, a brittle silence fell over the mountain. The world was transformed. Trees bowed beneath thick layers of snow. Rocks glazed in frost sparkled weakly in pale sunlight, and the air was crisp and biting. Emerging from the cave, the friends surveyed the area. Their gear remained arranged in those strange, symbolic patterns, undisturbed beneath a fresh blanket of powder. No footprints led to or from the cave, as if the watchers had vanished into thin air. The group made their cautious descent toward the ranger station miles below. Physically, they were unscathed, no frostbite, no injuries, but each carried an invisible weight, a lingering sense of something beyond explanation. Their faces were drawn, eyes haunted by memories of the blizzard's eerie presence. At the ranger station, their story was met with polite skepticism. Officials attributed their experience to exhaustion, hypothermia, and the disorienting effects of severe weather on perception. The mysterious arrangement of gear was dismissed as accidental, caused by shifting snow or their own movements during the storm. No evidence was found to support claims of strange creatures or supernatural watchers, yet the friends knew what they had encountered. The low guttural noises that echoed through the storm were not the calls of wolves or mountain lions. The shadows glimpsed between the trees were no bears or elk. The precise, unnatural patterns of their scattered gear were deliberate markers, signs of an intelligence observing them silently and patiently. Their bond, forged in shared hardship, grew stronger, but the encounter left an indelible mark on each of them. The mountain's ancient secrets had brushed against their lives, a reminder of wild forces that endure beyond human understanding. They spoke little of the event afterward, wary of disbelief and ridicule. In the years since, locals and hikers avoid that remote clearing, sensing an unspoken warning in the way the forest seems to hush when winter storms roll in. Ranger stations exchange hushed stories of strange noises and shadowy figures glimpsed during blizzards, tales passed quietly to those who know the mountains best. The blizzard in the Rockies remains a chilling testament to the unknown, a moment where nature's fury masks something watching, waiting beyond the veil of snow and silence, a presence immense, intelligent, and infinitely patient. It lingers still in the empty spaces between the pines, a shadow untouched by time, forever watching from the storm's heart. Nestled deep in the winding hills of the Ozark Mountains, where dense forests stretch for miles and the nights grow long and quiet, John Harper lived alone in a small, weather-beaten cabin, It was early spring of 2024, and the woods around his home were stirring with new life. The sharp scent of wet earth mixed with budding leaves, and the gentle murmur of creeks winding through the undergrowth. For John, however, the peaceful season offered little comfort. Battling his own fragile mental health, his nights were restless, haunted not just by his fears, but by something far stranger, the persistent sense that he was not alone. For weeks, John had noticed odd things happening around his cabin. At first, he dismissed the strange marks on his porch as the work of animals, deep, jagged scratches that carved into the old wood like claw marks. But these marks grew more frequent, sharper, as if left by something much larger than any raccoon or fox. Then came the missing objects. Chairs, gardening tools, even small boxes of supplies vanished overnight, only to reappear in unsettling arrangements. One morning, John found his fishing nets tangled not where he'd left them, but draped over branches in the nearby woods, hung like trophies in the early morning light. Most unsettling of all were the tufts of thick, dark hair left behind in places he often checked, on the doorstep, caught in the cracks of the cabin wall, and once, tangled in a bush by the edge of his property. The hair was coarse and matted, unlike any animal fur he recognized from the forest. Too dark, too heavy. The discoveries weighed on him heavily, stirring a mixture of fear and fascination. John's neighbors initially brushed off his warnings. They saw a man battling his mind, hearing what others couldn't, imagining threats where none existed. But as the weeks wore on, the strange disturbances spread beyond John's cabin. One by one, neighbors began to notice the same eerie signs. Doors they had locked were found ajar at dawn. Windows, firmly latched the night before, stood open, letting the cool mountain air drift through empty rooms. Items, simple things like mugs, blankets, and shoes, were found moved or placed in patterns that made no sense. A circle of stones on a porch, a line of sticks along a fence, a pile of leaves carefully stacked on a doorstep. Yet despite the strange rearrangements, there were no footprints in the soft earth, no marks in the dust or snow, no signs of forced entry or human passage. The only traces left behind were the same coarse tufts of dark hair, found in growing numbers on porches, scattered along paths, and even inside cabins where no one had entered overnight. Unease rippled through the community. The usual quiet confidence in the rugged mountain life gave way to whispered fears. Folks stopped staying out after dark. Neighbors locked their doors earlier and checked windows twice. Conversations grew hushed, eyes darting nervously toward the surrounding forest. One particularly cold night in late May, a neighbor named Sarah decided she could no longer wait for daylight to uncover the truth. She sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket on her porch, the wood creaking beneath her as a chilly wind rustled the newly grown leaves. The moon hung low and full, its silver light filtering through the branches and casting ghostly shadows on the ground. Hours slipped by in heavy silence. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of small creatures, seemed muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. Sarah's eyes strained through the darkness, watching the edge of the tree line where the forest met the cluster of cabins. Then, just before midnight, movement flickered in the shadows. A shape emerged from the dense trees, larger than any man, standing tall and broad-shouldered. It moved with an eerie grace, gliding silently between the cabins without disturbing a single leaf or twig. The figure paused beneath a porch light, its outline dark and indistinct, like a shadow made flesh. Sarah's heart pounded so fiercely she feared it might burst free of her chest, but she dared not cry out or move. The figure seemed to sense her gaze, pausing for a moment longer as if acknowledging her presence, then vanished as quietly as it had appeared, melting into the forest's depths. The sight left Sarah trembling, her breath caught in her throat, a cold shiver running down her spine. She was not alone in her fear. The neighbors soon shared their own tales of strange noises, deep growls and guttural whispers, the snapping of branches when no one was near, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching from just beyond the tree line. Despite the mounting unease, local authorities remained unconvinced. When residents reported the disturbances, officials chalked it up to pranksters or mischief caused by restless youths. They noted that wildlife, such as bears or bobcats, left tracks and signs, none of which matched the strange, precise rearrangements or the absence of footprints. Without concrete evidence, the incidents were dismissed as harmless, even imagined. But the community knew the truth was far different. The dark tufts of hair kept appearing, sometimes collected in neat bundles, as though left intentionally as messages or warnings. Scratches deepened on cabin walls, more elaborate and frequent. Objects were no longer simply moved, but arranged in symbols and shapes that no one could decipher. John, despite his fragile state, was unwavering. He spoke quietly but firmly of an ancient presence, something not hostile but watchful, a sentinel of the mountains and forests, a creature that moved unseen, silently observing those who dwelled too close, leaving cryptic signs in the night as a reminder that the wild was never truly tamed. The nights grew warmer as summer approached, but the cold shadow cast by the unseen visitor lingered. Porch lights burned late, dogs barked at invisible intruders, and children whispered about the shadow in their dreams. The forest itself seemed alive, the rustling of leaves a language no one yet understood. Even now, long after the initial disturbances, the sense of a silent watcher remains, a presence that roams the hills of the Ozarks, moving between the trees beneath the cover of darkness, leaving marks and clues but never revealing itself fully. The community lives with a shared unease, caught between disbelief and dread, knowing that some mysteries belong to the wild and must remain unanswered, their secrets etched deep within the shadows of the forest. John Harper's cabin stands quiet once more, but the scratches on its porch still tell a story, a warning or a message from the unseen visitor who watches from the darkness, patient and eternal, guarding the ancient woods of the Ozark Mountains.